I remember the mornings when getting out of bed felt like lifting a weight that no coffee or motivation could dissolve. Not because my schedule was overwhelming or my responsibilities unbearable, but because deep inside, something felt off, like a shadow lurking beneath my every move. There wasn't a glaring crisis, no dramatic event shaking the ground beneath me. Instead, it was this slow, almost imperceptible drain that gnawed at my energy, my sense of confidence, and the way I carried myself in the world. I found myself shrinking even as outwardly people said I looked fine, even strong. What I didn't see then, what I couldn't quite put my finger on, was how the spark I once recognized in my reflection was dimming from the inside out. It's strange how you can talk about wanting to feel alive, vibrant, unstoppable, and yet your body quietly tells a different story, like a silent agreement between mind and muscle, telling me that risk, effort, and exposure were now too dangerous, too costly. I started avoiding situations that once gave me a thrill. A simple glance in the mirror became a test I was losing. Each day, the man staring back seemed more hesitant, less sure. It was as if my own image, the one I held inside but rarely acknowledged, was cracking under unseen pressure. And with it, so was my energy, my drive, my presence. For a long time, I thought the problem lay out there. Some external enemy to fight or a quick fix I hadn't tried yet. Maybe it was stress, or the times I felt overlooked and underestimated. Maybe I just needed a change of routine, more sleep, better nutrition. But the truth was more intricate, more insidious. It was about the way my inner image of myself had been eroding, day by day, moment by moment. Not because I deliberately tore it down, but because of small defeats I never fully faced, the silent comparisons to others that whispered I wasn't enough, and the expectations I set that kept slipping beyond my reach. Over time, this quiet corrosion shaped not only how I thought but how my body subconsciously adjusted. Posture slumped, energy dimmed, presence faded. I never gave this much thought until one evening after a long day of feeling drained, when a friend asked me, "How do you see yourself right now?" At first, I shrugged it off. It seemed like a simple question. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized I didn't have a clear answer. The image I carried wasn't fixed. It was fragile, inconsistent, uncertain, and it was controlling more about me than I'd ever admitted. My body, the way I moved, the way I breathed, was responding to the quiet story I held within, the one I rarely voiced. It's a strange confrontation when you discover that the way you see yourself isn't just some abstract idea or psychological notion. It's biological. The body hears these unspoken beliefs and adjusts accordingly, shaping energy and even presence. I learned that no matter what I said aloud, if inside I believed I wasn't enough, or that I needed to shrink for safety, my body responded in kind. It's not about pretending to be confident or shouting affirmations. If they don't match that core image you carry, it's a mismatch that the body rejects. This realization changed everything for me. It reframed the way I saw my struggles, not as battles against external challenges alone, but as a deep internal battle with an invisible image silently dictating so much. The slow drain of energy, the mental fatigue that clouded my thoughts, the reluctance to push forward with intensity and courage, those were not random or inevitable. They were the body's way of conserving energy against a perceived risk. And when this state becomes normal, when it slips into the background without our notice, it's the most dangerous kind of trap. I recognized how many times I had unwittingly stepped into that trap, mistaking it for my natural state. What pulled me out of that spiral wasn't just willpower, it was a shift in understanding, a way to rebuild that inner image so the body would no longer react with retreat but with strength and steadiness. It was about alignment between who I know myself to be, who I believe I am beneath the doubts, and how I show up in the world. Restoring this coherence became essential, a silent transformative process beginning deep inside before any outward change was possible. Now, as I reflect on this journey, I wonder what moments in your life might have chipped away at your own self-image. Maybe it was a series of whispered not enoughs, or a single moment that started the slow erosion. Maybe it was comparing yourself silently to someone else's bravado, or a dream that felt just out of reach again and again. Whatever it was, it didn't just stay in your mind. It settled in your body, shaping how you move, breathe, and reclaim space. And if your body has been responding to this quiet erosion, then this is where the journey to reclaim energy, presence, and confidence truly begins. It starts deep inside, longer and quieter than we might expect, but with power that can reshape everything. There was a moment when I caught myself hesitating in front of a crowd, words ready on my tongue yet anchored by an invisible force. It wasn't a lack of preparation, nor was it unfamiliarity with the topic. Instead, a subtle resistance stirred within me, as if something contained in my core whispered caution, urging retreat. At that instant, I realized how much my internal narrative dictated my presence far beyond conscious decisions. It was as if my identity was tethered not just to thoughts or feelings but to a deeply ingrained physiological response, a mechanism carefully tuned over the years through countless tiny moments of self-doubt and quiet surrender. I remember one afternoon sitting on a park bench, observing people passing by with confident strides. Their poise, their open gazes, stirred something within me. It wasn't envy but curiosity. How did they manage to embody such assuredness? Was it merely a habit, or was it something more primal, woven into how they physically engaged with the world? That day, I began sensing that the way I carried myself wasn't a mere consequence of mood fluctuating, but an ongoing dialogue between what I thought about myself and the energies radiating outward in each movement, like a dance between what's inside and what's projected, with each step shaped by silent codes written long ago. Later, during a late-night conversation with a close friend, we spoke about resilience. Not the loud, heroic kind applauded in stories, but the subtle kind that persists through small, everyday moments. He mentioned something unexpected. That personal resilience, especially for men, often reveals itself less through bursts of vigor and more through endurance in the face of internal conflict. This shifted my perspective. Strength isn't always an explosive event but a patient refusal to surrender to erosion. It's in the quiet moments when we choose to hold our ground despite the weight of accumulated disappointments and invisible wounds. It struck me how much hormonal balance mirrors this delicate interplay. Testosterone, often misunderstood as simply related to aggression or dominance, actually carries a narrative of integrity between one's inner convictions and outward expression. When someone harbors unresolved conflicts or harbors unspoken fears, the hormonal signals can falter, not as punishment but as a biological negotiating tactic, a recalibration signaling, slow down, or protect. Consider that for many men, the loss of energy or drive doesn't emerge from a single traumatic event but from the gradual leveling off of this internal dialogue, a kind of subtle recalibration gone astray over time. One evening, while journaling, I tried imagining what it might feel like for that internal observer to watch my image of self warp unpredictably. How the small cracks formed after moments dismissed too quickly or feelings brushed aside. I pictured it like a glass sculpture shattered not by a single blow but by countless vibrations. The shards didn't scream. Instead, they settled quietly, changing how light passed through. Similarly, the silent erosion of self-perception alters how energy flows through a person's entire system, often leaving them drained without obvious cause. An incident at work further illuminated this. I was assigned a project that required leadership and visible confidence. During the initial meeting, I felt tension coil around my chest as internal hesitations kicked in, though my mind was clear. I noticed my stance shrinking. My voice lost some of its natural resonance. Through that experience, I realized that unspoken self-judgments were actively modifying how I inhabited space and communicated. These changes weren't just psychological, they were manifest, tangible shifts in presence that coworkers could sense, whether or not they understood the reasons behind it. I started experimenting with subtle adjustments, standing taller, breathing more intentionally, holding eye contact longer. These felt like small rebellions against the quiet whispers of doubt embedded in me. Each movement rewrote an old narrative scripted by years of unnoticed erosion. It wasn't about faking confidence or forcing an identity on myself. Rather, it was a gradual reclaiming of coherence between the stories I told internally and the signals my body emitted outwardly. This process felt much like restoring an old instrument, fine-tuning strings to create a harmonious sound that had been lost under layers of dust. What's compelling about all this is how it changes the timeline of transformation. Shifts don't come from moments of grand revelation alone, but emerge in the accumulation of incremental micro-decisions. Choosing to meet the world with steadiness after a day of uncertainty, speaking up quietly when you feel silenced, allowing yourself grace in moments of hesitation. Each builds the groundwork for restoring an energetic foundation. It's a reminder that resilience isn't about perfection but a steadfast commitment to internal alignment. I realized that reclaiming energy isn't a straightforward climb uphill, but more like rediscovering the roots beneath a tree that's weathered storms. Without nurturing those roots, our sense of worth and authentic self-image, no growth above ground can sustain real strength or vibrancy. And this rerooting demands patience, curiosity, and above all, kindness toward oneself. When I started offering myself this kind of attention, the landscape shifted. What once felt like a fog began thinning, revealing potential for steadiness that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. Now, I encourage you to reflect on moments where unacknowledged hurts or subtle wear and tear may have confined your energy. What invisible patterns guide how you engage with the world? What might happen if, instead of pushing harder against fatigue or withdrawal, you leaned into restoring those unseen foundations with compassion? Sometimes, the boldest acts of courage emerge not in outward battle but in the gentle work of rebuilding what's been quietly undermined. This invites a different kind of strength, one that doesn't just survive but flourishes by honoring the full complexity of our inner experience. There was a time when I found myself standing on the edge of a bustling room, surrounded by familiar faces but feeling utterly invisible. It wasn't because I was genuinely unnoticed. Rather, an invisible barrier had grown between me and those around me. I could feel my own energy folding inward, as if I were retreating into an internal shell. That retreat didn't begin overnight. It had been a slow unraveling, a gradual tightening of my inner landscape. It was during that moment of acute isolation that I realized how much the way I perceived myself was shaping not only my interactions but the very way I inhabited space. It wasn't a question of confidence or ego anymore. It was about alignment between my inner conviction and the signals I unconsciously radiated. On another occasion, I recall a training session where I was asked to lead a group exercise. Usually enthusiastic and expressive, I noticed my gestures growing small, measured, almost cautious. As I observed myself, a distinct tension surfaced. My instincts were holding back. There was a hesitancy, a kind of self-imposed limitation that wasn't prompted by external judgment but by an undercurrent of unresolved self-questioning. That moment made me grasp how much I had internalized subtle narratives about worthiness that reflected not only in my mindset but also in how I physically engaged others. I realized my reluctance to fully step forward wasn't a matter of skill or intent. It was an embodied response rooted in past echoes of inadequacy. One evening, after a particularly exhausting week, I sat quietly in my room, flicking through photos of moments when I had seemed vibrant and alive. I was struck by a startling contrast. The energy and openness caught in those images didn't match the sluggishness and constriction that had crept into daily life. It prompted a question. What accounts for this disparity between past vitality and current fatigue? The answer, I began to understand, had less to do with external stressors and more to do with how fragments of disappointment and unmet expectations had subtly chipped away at my self-directed narrative. What's fascinating is how these internal fissures don't just stay in the mind. They subtly shift posture, tone, even how I manage energy reserves. Before I knew it, the pattern had been etched into my nervous system, dictating a more cautious engagement with each new day. An unexpected spark came during a casual conversation with a mentor, who challenged me to consider how habitual patterns of self-judgment could quietly throttle my physical vitality. He said, "You don't just carry your thoughts. You live inside them, and they live inside you." That metaphor lingered, because it captured something profound. An internal voice layered with criticism was not simply an abstract dialogue, but a physiological force influencing my stamina, motivation, and even hormonal responses. He introduced me to the idea of energetic congruence, a state in which mental narratives, emotional tone, and physical expression harmonize, enabling a sustained dynamism. The concept thrilled me because it suggested that changing how I spoke to myself could unlock reservoirs of vigor I hadn't accessed in years. In the days that followed, I deliberately experimented with subtle shifts. Instead of allowing my shoulders to slump after a misstep, I caught myself resetting to uprightness, signaling alertness despite any inner unease. When despair crept in during quiet moments, I practiced redirecting attention toward memories of past successes or strengths. These micro-interventions felt awkward at first, like trying on clothes that didn't quite fit. Yet gradually, they began to reshape an internal environment that had grown neglected. I observed that when thought and posture aligned positively, energy pulsated stronger, and mental fatigue gave way to renewed clarity. It was not magic, but a synchrony that required ongoing attunement. Now, consider how this applies when you face challenges that tap into your sense of self. Imagine moments where stress blankets your mind or setbacks make you question your capacity. What if, in those situations, there were ways to recalibrate your internal ecosystem? To interrupt the cycle where mental strain suppresses vitality? For example, learning to anchor yourself through breathing techniques or brief physical resets can reestablish a connection between intention and action. These tools do more than manage symptoms. They gently retrain the complex interplay between self-perception and physiological states. Alongside these strategies, I discovered the power of narrative reframing, the conscious act of shifting internal stories that no longer serve growth. Instead of silently cataloging failures or perceived inadequacies, I began acknowledging progress and resilience. This practice didn't erase setbacks but contextualized them within a broader continuum of learning. Another crucial layer is embracing vulnerability not as weakness but as an honest admission that fuels deeper self-awareness. When I started inviting compassion toward moments of imperfection, I noticed that tension dissolved more quickly, releasing trapped energy and facilitating more authentic presence. Through this evolving journey, I grew aware that natural hormonal rhythms are deeply intertwined with these internal dialogues. Rather than viewing chemistry as static or purely biological, I came to appreciate its fluid responsiveness to psychological states. For instance, periods of self-doubt or guardedness could unintentionally dampen hormonal vitality, while moments of congruent confidence and openness tended to support balanced energy flow. This realization reframed how I approached daily rhythms, not just managing external factors but fostering environments internally that nurtured hormonal harmony. I want you to imagine this, that every subtle thought, each internal story you tell yourself, activates a cascade of responses beyond conscious control. What stories have silently taken residence within your mind? What if by gently interrogating and reweaving these narratives, you could awaken a more sustained and robust energy? This path doesn't demand overnight transformation but invites a patient, attentive exploration of the currents beneath your habitual patterns. The courage to step into this work becomes a gateway toward reclaiming not only vigor but also a renewed sense of command over your lived experience. In recognizing and reshaping these unseen scripts, a profound shift happens, one that resonates far beyond mere physical vitality, touching the very essence of who you are. It was during a quiet hike along a rugged trail that I first noticed the subtle messages my breathing was sending. Each inhale felt shallow at times, as if my lungs were reluctant visitors rather than willing participants. I realized my nervous system was covertly moderating energy release, cautiously rationing strength to avoid vulnerability. Yet the strange paradox was this. While my conscious mind longed for expansion and challenge, my physiology carefully curtailed the very essence of vitality. That moment felt like encountering a hidden script I hadn't read before, an internal economy controlling resources far beyond deliberate intention. Later that week, I shared this observation with a close companion, someone who partnered with me through phases of uncertainty. His response was unexpected. Maybe your system is protecting something precious, not from others, but from a self that once felt fractured, he said. This suggestion made me reconsider protection not merely as an external defense but as an internal safeguard shaped by past wounds. His words lingered, prompting me to trace the origins of this resistance. I began unearthing relationships, decisions, and moments that quietly carved niches of fear beneath the surface of my confidence. In one vivid memory, I recalled a meeting where a tossed comment slipped past me, barely audible but weighted, a hint that I wasn't meeting certain expectations. At the time, I nodded politely, But afterward, the remark replayed incessantly, fueling internal doubts. It wasn't the event itself that drained my energy, but the silent accumulation of unspoken criticisms that I absorbed without voice. This continuous undercurrent shifted my posture in every subsequent encounter, creating a subtle but persistent barrier to optimism. It became clear that these invisible patterns were far more influential than isolated incidents, gradually becoming tangled into the fabric of my existence. Curiously, I observed that moments when I forced myself forward with sheer willpower ended in exhaustion rather than triumph. It was as if an unseen resistance pulled against me, a tension not from the outer challenge but from within. That internal friction resembled an old engine grinding teeth beneath a fragile hood, strained, rhythmically battling corrosion that no amount of surface polish could erase. Recognizing this allowed me to stop blaming sheer fatigue or laziness and instead investigate the emotional currents steering that exhaustion. Through this lens, I saw how layered complex stories about failure and inadequacy were woven into the very way my energy ebbed. One afternoon, while sitting by a window watching rain cascade down, I reflected on the metaphor of a river run dry. We often think depletion is from excessive use, but sometimes it flows thin because the source is blocked. In my case, long-held silences about disappointment, fear, or frustration formed dam-like structures obstructing the natural flow of life force. That insight reframed my approach. Instead of forcing more energy outward blindly, I began learning where the blockages were, how loss of flow occurred, and what it meant to gently remove the logs and stones piled up over the years. Embracing vulnerability became an act of opening gates rather than exposing weakness. This process revealed itself intimately in an unexpected way. During a weekend retreat focused on movement and presence, I was invited to walk barefoot across uneven terrain. At first, each step felt precarious, demanding my full attention. But as my feet adapted, I discovered a newfound sense of grounding, not just physical but emotional. The unevenness mirrored internal instability, yet meeting it with sincerity birthed a steadying force. It was a tribute to resilience not forged through hardness but through flexible engagement. This embodied learning started rewriting my relationship with discomfort. Instead of recoiling from it, I began to perceive tension as a message, a map guiding me toward areas needing care and recalibration. In moments of solitude, I experimented with extending this awareness beyond movement into interaction. I noted how my voice softened when surrounded by unfamiliar faces, as if a damper was placed over enthusiasm. Confronting this, I consciously practiced speaking with firmer tone and clarity, even when uncertainty crept in. Each attempt felt like reclaiming a small piece of territory previously ceded to self-doubt. These gestures created ripples of confidence that slowly reshaped my overall stance toward life's demands. The tension between desire and restriction didn't instantly vanish, but it morphed into something navigable, a dialogue rather than a deadlock. Reflecting on these discoveries, I came to appreciate that restoring lasting vigor required more than surface adjustments or optimistic thinking. It demanded a delicate harmonization of our inner scripts with the rhythms of our physical presence. This harmony, I learned, thrives when we allow ourselves to patiently excavate hidden wounds and unmet needs encoded beneath daily habits. When we give permission to those silent parts to emerge and be heard, the system gradually reframes itself toward openness and aliveness. This internal realignment, subtle though powerful, is the foundation for embodying strength that sustains itself beyond fleeting moments. Now, imagine carrying this awareness forward, not as a single act of will but as a conversation unfolding within you. What narratives have built invisible barricades around your vitality? Where might you gently remove obstruction to restore flow? Recognizing these questions is an invitation, not to overwhelm with fixes, but to engage with compassion and steady curiosity. It's in this unfolding process that real renewal can begin, allowing life's energy to pulse with renewed depth and resilience. Reflecting on this journey so far, I find myself standing at a crossroads where shadows of resistance meet flickers of awakening. It's as if I'm navigating a landscape sculpted by invisible currents, hidden winds that have shaped not just my emotions but the very architecture of my presence. These currents, subtle yet persistent, have loosened the foundations beneath my sense of self, leaving corners within me where light hesitates to reach. Yet, amid this suspension, there arises a growing awareness, a whispered invitation to engage with the unknown territory inside me. This invitation compels me to listen closely, not only to what's surfaced but to the silent spaces between those moments. There's a curious alchemy happening here, an interplay that refuses to be confined by common understanding. The tensions that once constrained movement begin to sing in a different key, their resistance transforming into a rhythm that beckons exploration. It reminds me of a forest that endures seasons of drought and storm. Beneath the withered leaves, roots pulse quietly, gathering strength unseen. What may appear as stillness or decay on the outside holds the promise of renewal beneath the surface. In a similar way, the internal landscapes I traverse are layered with complexity. Pockets of fragility entwined with resilience, hesitation shadowed by a deep-seated yearning for coherence. At times, I catch myself holding my breath, awaiting a shift to crystallize, as if my very cells anticipate a realignment that hasn't yet fully arrived. There is an unspoken dialogue unfolding inside, a negotiation between the impulse to protect and the instinct to expand, the familiar and the unexplored. Within this fragile tension lies an opening that emerges through quiet patience and gentle courage. It is a space where vulnerability does not signal surrender but signals an essential prelude to transformation. Navigating this subtle dance feels like tracing wind patterns with fingertips, intangible, elusive, yet undeniable in their force. I recall moments in conversations where the edges of my guardedness softened just enough to glimpse a more expansive possibility. It wasn't in grand gestures, but in brief instances. A steadying breath before speaking, a deliberate pause before retreating into silence. These moments serve as gentle reminders that coherence arises neither from forcing the narrative nor fleeing discomfort, but from allowing an alignment to emerge organically. They reveal the exquisite balance between honoring protective instincts and opening pathways to fuller presence. It's a tender harmony, delicate yet profound, like the first light filtering through ancient branches after a long night. As the internal dialogue continues, an emerging thread starts weaving itself through the fabric of experience, one that intertwines identity, energy, and intention into a subtle yet powerful tapestry. It feels like tracing the path of a river that bends and curves, shaping the land in its passage, carving meaning through erosion and flow. In this unfolding current, the past conversations with myself take on new dimensions, revealing themselves less as isolated episodes and more as integral movements within a longer journey toward inner unity. I sense a growing invitation to inhabit this evolving narrative with grace, to move beyond the confines of fragmented images and fragmented breath, toward a more fluid embodiment of self that absorbs tension without being fragmented by it. There is a promise that by embracing this process, the internal dissonance might transform into a symphony of coherence and strength. And with that promise comes a quiet hope that the alignment we seek can become a lived reality, expressed through the fullness of our posture, presence, and sustained energy. In this threshold moment, I hold space for both longing and uncertainty. I recognize that the terrain ahead will require continued vigilance, not the oppressive kind that fatigues, but a mindful awareness that honors the delicate mechanisms by which we protect and create. It is here, in this liminal space, that I feel the momentum gathering quietly, inviting each step forward to be both intentional and compassionate. The journey unfolds less as a linear path and more as a spiral dance, circling deeper into understanding even as it expands outward toward renewal. And so, as I prepare to move beyond this reflection, I carry with me the intricate map etched by these inner shifts, a map woven from breath, posture, story, and quiet resolve. The terrain I traverse is no longer a battleground but a living ecosystem, where every gesture, every thought, becomes a seed awaiting fertile ground. The tension between protection and presence has begun to soften, revealing the subtle architecture of strength rooted in honoring the full human experience. It is this living complexity that holds the key to the next step, a threshold where awakening gains form, and energy takes on a sustained, authentic pulse. With awareness as my compass and courage as my guide, the The moment draws near to step through the veil of uncertainty and into an embodiment aligned, where inner conviction and outward expression meld. Here, the journey whispers not an end, but a profound beginning shaped by coherence, resilience, and the quiet power of becoming whole. As I move through this space I've quietly come to inhabit, I realize how intricately our inner perceptions weave themselves into every fiber of our being. It's a subtle conversation between belief and biology, an ongoing dialogue where the stories I carry sculpt the very landscape of my energy, posture, and presence. This interplay is neither accidental nor trivial. It's a living testament to how deeply connected our minds and bodies truly are, shaping how we emerge into each new moment. I think back to countless mornings when my limbs seemed hesitant to respond, my breath shallow, as if surrendering control to an unseen guardian wary of risking exposure. Those sensations were far from random. They were echoes of a self-image quietly fraying over time, a self that my body responded to with cautious reserve. In these moments, my body whispered truths my mind had not yet fully acknowledged, truths embedded within the architecture of my muscles and nerves, held in tension between fear and hope. This somatic knowledge, elusive yet powerful, carries more weight than words alone can bear. What strikes me now is how restoration unfolds primarily through a deep nurturing of inner alignment. It's not about chasing external validation or pushing harder against resistance. Instead, it calls us to embrace a tender process of reconnection, a poetic unraveling of hardened patterns, a gentle reclamation of a self previously fractured by unnoticed wounds and whispered doubts. Transforming this resonance demands patience, as well as courage to face discomfort without flinching, opening pathways toward integration that echo far beyond the physical. I recall a moment witnessing a friend stepping into a room with unmistakable ease, his every gesture radiating calm command. Watching him, I confronted my own struggle with internal dissonance. His authenticity revealed a harmony I yearned to realize within myself, a fusion of self-awareness and grounded confidence arising from congruent self-perception. That image became a kind of lighthouse illuminating the possibility of realignment, urging me to sift through layers of conditioned hesitation and unspoken fears to arrive at a place where my body and spirit no longer labored in discord. This process reshaped how I perceive resilience. Instead of a blunt force propelling life forward, it emerged as a skillful navigation through uncertainty, an artful balance of vulnerability alongside steadfastness. The tension between protection and openness doesn't disappear but transforms into a language I can read, an invitation to listen more deeply. Each time I choose presence over retreat, I learn a new stanza in this evolving dialogue, one that harmonizes intention, emotion, and physicality into a coherent whole. In this way, hormonal health and energy no longer represent abstract functions isolated within biology. They signify the material expression of inner harmony or discord. Recognizing this intimate choreography compels me to honor the relationship between self-perception and physiological vitality as one continuous interplay. Healing then becomes a creative act, an ongoing dance to cultivate connection, reclaim authenticity, and inspire strength from the core outward. So here I stand, embracing the work yet to come with humility and resolve. What challenges remain are invitations to deepen awareness, to explore the contours of identity still shadowed by quiet insecurities. With every breath, step, and choice, I reaffirm my commitment to fostering coherence within. Knowing this is where true energy finds fertile ground to flourish. It is within these moments of steady attention that transformation roots itself, transcending fleeting fixes to become a lasting embodiment of power and presence. I invite you to embark on this journey alongside me, not as an immediate conquest but as a continuous unfolding. Where might you begin to notice the subtle hesitations your body carries? Which stories may be quietly shaping the way you move through your own days? By approaching these questions with kindness and curiosity, we open a door to reclaiming vitality that is authentic and wholehearted. Together, we step into an unfolding narrative where identity, energy, and essence merge, not as fragments to be repaired, but as a living, breathing harmony ready to be lived fully.